Every year, numerous high school students turn to the influential U.S. News and World Report rankings to objectively compare universities and help inform their college decisions. The rankings have been published annually for 40 years. In 2023, U.S. News claimed that over 35 million people had consulted their rankings in the preceding year. Going to the right schools can affect your network and your competitiveness for graduate programs and jobs with prestigious companies. A degree from a top university also confers a level of pedigree. The Varsity Blues scandal showed the extent to which parents were willing to lie and cheat to get their children into the right colleges. But what if the colleges themselves are lying about how good they are? What if those rankings contained numbers that were completely made up? And what if one of those schools that was making up its numbers was an Ivy League school, considered one of the best schools in the world, but that now appears to have lied its way up to a number 2 spot on the charts? 80% of a college's U.S. News ranking relies on figures that colleges submit to the magazine themselves. There is very little oversight to confirm that these numbers are actually accurate, and studies have shown that rankings do matter. Research from the American Educational Research Association has shown that being in the top 25 of the U.S. News rankings can increase a school's applications by 6 to 10% and increases the academic competitiveness of the incoming class. Therefore, perhaps it should come as no surprise that in the past, colleges have been found to intentionally submit falsified numbers to increase their rankings. In 2012, Claremont McKenna College admitted that for 6 years, from 2005 to 2011, the Dean of Admissions submitted inflated SAT scores to the U.S. News rankings. The same year, Emory University confessed that for over a decade, administrators had intentionally reported inflated standardized test scores and had inflated the portion of incoming students who graduated in the top of their high school class. Submitting fake data for rankings has even resulted in a jail sentence. In 2021, Masha Porat, the dean of Temple University's Fox School of Business, was sentenced to 14 months in prison after being found guilty of submitting fraudulent data to the U.S. News rankings from 2014 to 2018 with the aim of boosting rankings and increasing revenues. His fraudulent data regarding enrollment, test scores, and student work experience resulted in a number 1 ranking for the school's online MBA program. He was accused of using higher rankings to defraud applicants, students, and donors out of money, and he was convicted on charges of wire fraud and wire fraud conspiracy. However, the U.S. News rankings received perhaps their most high-profile scandal when it was revealed that Columbia University, a venerated Ivy League institution that was the alma mater of former President Barack Obama, and had been ranked in the top 5 for over a decade, had submitted falsified numbers for years, possibly decades. Their false numbers had resulted in the school being ranked as high as number 2 nationwide in the 2022 chart, behind only Princeton and tied with Harvard and MIT. The high-profile cheating scandal shook the reputation of Columbia and left the university facing class action lawsuits from disgruntled former students. In this video, we will explore how the fraud was exposed, what numbers were falsified, and how Columbia responded and the consequences Columbia faced. We will also explore what the scandal revealed about which other institutions might be cheating and how much the rankings can be trusted at all. Columbia's ranking scandal was exposed by one of its own professors. Michael Thaddeus, a Harvard graduate who had also studied at the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, was a tenured professor who had taught math at Columbia for 24 years. Michael Thaddeus looked at everything around him and simply didn't believe the number 2 ranking. In 1998, Columbia had been ranked at number 18. Over the next few years, it experienced a meteoric rise that, according to Thaddeus, no other top schools had matched. Curious, Thaddeus decided to figure out why. He compared the figures reported to the U.S. News with figures reported to the government or made public elsewhere, and found inconsistencies with regard to undergraduate class size, percent of faculty with terminal degrees, percent of faculty who were full-time, student-faculty ratio, and financial resources, amongst others. The discrepancies were usually in Columbia's favor. This led Thaddeus to conclude that several of the key figures supporting Columbia's high ranking were inaccurate, dubious, or highly misleading. Thaddeus also found that Columbia made it difficult for others to confirm the accuracy of its figures. Most universities participated in the Common Dataset, an initiative organized by Peterson's, the College Board, and U.S. News, in which universities publicly disclosed information about class size, subtotals of faculty with bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees, and other useful metrics. Columbia was one of only 8 universities nationwide that at the time of Thaddeus's investigation did not publicly release a common dataset. Class size made up 8% of a school's U.S. News score. Smaller class sizes were considered an indicator of higher quality. Columbia claimed that 82.5% of its undergraduate classes had 20 students or less. This figure was the absolute highest of any other top 100 university and the 4th highest of all 392 schools ranked by U.S. News. The next closest schools in the top 100 were the University of Chicago at 78.9% and the University of Rochester at 78.5%. Michael Thaddeus decided to test these numbers against an online directory of classes, which listed enrollment in each course. He used the Internet Archive to find enrollment numbers for the past semesters relevant to the rankings. The class size metric was based on any class that enrolled at least one undergraduate, which possibly included graduate school classes, so Thaddeus could only estimate a possible range. He assumed that every course designated an undergraduate course had at least one undergraduate student. As for graduate school courses, in his strictest estimate, he assumed that no undergrad was enrolled in any grad school course. In his loosest estimate, he assumed that every grad school course, excluding faculties that explicitly prohibited undergrads, like the law school, had at least one undergraduate enrolled in the course. With these guidelines, he estimated that the percentage of class sizes with under 20 students was between 62.7% and 66.9%, a far cry from the 82.5% Columbia was reporting. 3% of the ranking was based on the percent of full-time faculty with PhDs or a terminal degree in their field. Columbia reported that 100% of their faculty had terminal degrees, compared with 94% for Princeton, 91% for Harvard, and 93% for Yale. Thaddeus could immediately see that this 100% figure was not true, because he could immediately identify notable exceptions. For example, Orhan Pamuk, a Columbia literature professor and Nobel Prize winner, only had a bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Istanbul. Excluding those with master's degrees in fine arts, Thaddeus identified at least 66 members of the faculty whose highest degrees were only a bachelor's or master's, which was enough to exceed 1% of the full-time faculty members. He estimated that the percentage of full-time faculty with terminal degrees was 96% at best. Columbia also reported that 96.5% of their non-medical faculty were full-time, compared to 93.8% for Princeton, 94.5% for Harvard, and 86.2% for Yale. Thaddeus compared these numbers with those that Columbia had submitted to the National Center for Education Statistics, a federal agency. He found that Columbia had reported a figure of only 74.1% to the government. The two statistics did have slightly different criteria. For example, the U.S. News figure leaves out professors on sabbatical or administrators with faculty status. But these differences were not enough to explain the large discrepancy. Columbia also had a larger discrepancy than any other top 100 school. Columbia claimed its student-faculty ratio was 6-1. U.S. News required that graduate students be included in the student-faculty ratio, if certain faculty taught both graduate students and undergraduates. Therefore, grad students in an exclusively graduate program like the law school would be excluded, but grad students in a faculty like the Faculty of Engineering, which had both undergraduate and graduate students, should be included in the student-faculty ratio. However, Columbia completely excluded all graduate students from its calculations and included only undergraduates. Thaddeus estimated that if reporting were done correctly, the student-faculty ratio would be closer to 11 to 1, using Columbia's reported 96.5% full-time faculty ratio, or at best 8 to 1, using the lower 74.1% full-time faculty ratio they reported to the government. Interestingly, Thaddeus found that every single school in the top 10 was incorrectly excluding graduate students from its calculations of student-faculty ratio, while many lower-ranked schools were correctly including graduate students, which meant that schools that were following the rules were putting themselves at a competitive disadvantage. One of the areas in which Columbia most egregiously misrepresented its data was financial resources, which accounted for 10% of the ranking. Columbia reported $3.1 billion in instructional spending, the single highest number for any university, and higher than Harvard, Yale, and Princeton combined. Thaddeus noted that in Columbia's consolidated financial statements, they claimed to spend only $2 billion on instruction and education administration, while claiming they spent $1.2 billion on patient care. He also noticed that in Columbia's reporting to the Department of Education, patient care was not included, but the total spending is the same on both reports, indicating that patient care was subsumed within educational spending. Columbia was therefore counting its spending on patient care as part of its spending on student instruction. Other schools did not appear to do this. For example, Columbia's New York neighbor, NYU, could have significantly improved its number 29 ranking if it included its whopping $6.7 billion worth of patient care as part of instructional spending, but it did not. 35% of the U.S. News ranking was based on student outcomes such as student retention rates, graduation rates, and student debt. Columbia reported that 96% of its undergrads graduated within 6 years. In this category, the figures reported to the U.S. News actually did match the figures reported to the government and were thus technically accurate. However, Thaddeus pointed out that U.S. News ranking methodology excluded transfer students, which allowed Columbia to paint a rosier picture than reality. About 30% of Columbia undergraduates were transfer students, the highest of any Tier 1 university. In comparison, less than 5% of Harvard, Yale, or Princeton undergraduates were transfers. Most transfer students at Columbia were enrolled at a particular school, the Columbia School of General Studies, an undergraduate college that targeted non-traditional students. Almost 75% of students in this college arrived with some transfer credit. At Columbia, only 85% of transfer students graduated within 6 years, far lower than the 96% among non-transfers. If the outcomes of transfer students were included in the U.S. News methodology, then Columbia, with its large percentage of transfers, would be affected far more than its peers. For example, Thaddeus estimated that Columbia would fall from 6th to 26th in the 6-year graduation rate category if transfers were included. In conclusion, Thaddeus found inconsistencies in figures that made up 23% of the ranking. 35% of the ranking were based on student outcome that would plummet if transfers were included. 20% of the rankings was based on a peer assessment score, in which college presidents, provosts, and admission deans were asked to rate other schools. Thaddeus argued that the peer review score could become an echo chamber in which biases and inaccuracies in the rankings were simply amplified. According to Michael Bastedo, an educational sociologist at the University of Michigan, rankings drive reputation. Bastedo argues that when college presidents, provosts, and deans are asked to perform the impossible task of assessing the merits of dozens of institutions they may know little about, they rely on the only source of detailed information at their disposal, which is the U.S. News rankings. The rankings then turn into a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more a school moves up in the rankings, the better a reputation score they get in the peer review. A further 20% of the rankings was based on factors that Thaddeus could not find readily available data on, such as alumni giving rate and faculty compensation. However, the inaccuracies in other categories cast doubt on whether these remaining figures could be trusted. At first, Columbia stood by its data. The administration argued that its 100% terminal degrees figures was rounded up, and that many programs, such as creative writing, did not require PhDs. They claimed that the directory of classes Thaddeus used to compute class size was not an official record of enrollment used by the registrar, and that their student-faculty ratio would be even lower if they included all their part-time staff. They even defended their inclusion of patient care costs in instructional spending, arguing that patient care and instruction occurred concurrently for over 4,000 students in medical fields. The U.S. News asked Columbia to substantiate the figures it had submitted. They claimed they received no satisfactory response from the university. The magazine therefore removed Columbia from their rankings for that year. In the summer of 2022, Columbia faced 2 class action lawsuits from former students. The lawsuits claimed that Columbia intentionally deceived students by falsifying data submitted to the U.S. News and offering an inferior product to what was advertised. One lawsuit states that had students known of Columbia's misreporting of data and deceptive practices, they would not have applied to Columbia and would not have agreed to pay premiums for tuition, fees, and costs based in material part upon Columbia's U.S. News ranking. The former students are seeking over $5 million in damages. Despite initially defending its data, Columbia announced that it would not submit data for the next year's rankings, claiming they needed time to analyze their data and address the criticisms raised by Thaddeus. In the fall of 2022, the university finally publicly released a common data set with the stated goal of increasing data accuracy and transparency. At the same time, the school released a statement admitting inaccuracies in the data submitted to U.S. News, but in just 2 fields. First, they admitted that the percentage of full-time faculty with terminal degrees was 95%, not 100% as previously reported. They also admitted that the portion of classes with fewer than 20 students was just 57%, not the 82.5% they had previously claimed. However, they stood by their other figures. The following year, U.S. News released a new rank for Columbia based on data from the U.S. Education Department's National Center for Education Statistics and the government's College Scorecard, which provides data on graduation rates and other demographic information. For any other data that was not publicly obtainable, the U.S. News used an estimate based on an average of peer schools minus 15%. The new score resulted in a number 18 rank for Columbia in the 2023 chart, the lowest rank among the Ivy League schools. In June of 2023, Columbia announced that it would no longer participate in the U.S. News rankings, citing its concern about the outsized influence the rankings played in the undergraduate admission process. This came on the heels of various graduate schools that had refused to continue participating in the U.S. News law school and medical school rankings. Yale Law School had started the trend despite being ranked number 1, and other prestigious law schools and medical schools had followed suit. But Columbia was the first high-profile school to refuse to participate in the national undergraduate rankings, and so far no other Ivies have joined them. Their attempt to frame the move as a principled stand was undoubtedly tarnished by the fact that they had just been caught cheating. Furthermore, in various interviews, Columbia administrators expressed concern about how the inclusion of their general studies program, the college that admitted a lot of non-traditional students and transfers, would affect their ranking. It should be noted that upon releasing their common dataset, Columbia carefully released two separate common datasets, separating the data for the College of General Studies from the data for their other two undergraduate schools, Columbia College and the School of Engineering and Applied Science. Columbia's plummet in the rankings might have cast doubt on the university's reputation, but it also cast doubt on the rankings themselves. It suggested that the rankings could easily be manipulated. Numerous critics, from Thaddeus to Malcolm Gladwell, who had vocally criticized college rankings for years, speculated that other schools were likely also cheating and that Columbia was just the highest profile school to get caught. As previously mentioned, Thaddeus found that every single school in the top 10 was miscalculating student-faculty ratio by wrongfully excluding graduate students in faculties where both grad students and undergraduates were taught. Thaddeus found that Johns Hopkins University's student-faculty ratio jumped from 10-1 to 7-1 in a single year, implying that they had suddenly altered their methodology. He also noted that the University of Pennsylvania used to append a note to its government reporting that its student-faculty ratio counted undergraduates only, but later stopped this practice. He accused them of continuing to bend the rules while no longer acknowledging it. Thaddeus also noticed that the University of Chicago and the University of Rochester, the two schools ranked behind Columbia as having purportedly the number 2 and number 3 highest percentage of classes with fewer than 20 students, were also among the 8 schools that, like Columbia, did not release common datasets. In a profile for the Columbia University student newspaper, Thaddeus specifically named the University of Chicago as one school that certainly warrants some investigation. However, Thaddeus called Columbia's level of falsification atypical and extreme, reminding readers of Columbia's false claims to have the highest proportion of small class sizes among the top 100 schools in the country and to spend more on instruction than Harvard, Yale, and Princeton combined. It is unlikely that many other schools were misrepresenting themselves on this scale. While some schools might be manipulating their rankings by falsifying data, others have gamed the rankings in perfectly legal ways, showing how easily the rankings can be manipulated. In 2008, Baylor offered financial rewards to admitted students to retake their SATs for a higher score in order to increase Baylor's rankings. While Columbia submitted false data to climb up the charts, its fellow Ivy League school, the University of Pennsylvania, was transparent about how it rose from number 20 in 1988, the lowest ranked Ivy behind Columbia, to as high as number 6 within just 12 years. In a 2001 Atlantic Monthly article, Penn's Dean of Admissions laid out how the school had changed its admission policies to admit significantly larger portions of its freshman class through the early decision process, allowing it to drive down selectivity amongst regular decision applicants and significantly decrease its overall selectivity rate. One of the most notable surges in the rankings came from Northeastern University in Boston, which rose over 100 spots from number 162 in 1996 to number 44 by 2023. This was due to a concerted effort by one of its former presidents to specifically climb up the U.S. News rankings. Northeastern deliberately limited many class sizes to 19 students maximum. They also hired more faculty to improve class size and student-faculty ratio. The school also built more dorms, as this was found to improve student retention, and participated in a common application, plus dropped the SAT requirements for foreign students, in order to drive up the number of applicants and drive down selectivity. There's no question that the system invites gaming, said the former Northeastern president, Richard Freeland, in an interview with Boston Magazine in 2014. We made a systematic effort to influence the outcome. The U.S. News has responded to criticism by continuously re-evaluating and refining its rankings criteria in order to improve quality and stability. In recent years, they have placed greater emphasis on social mobility and student outcomes. Many criteria that have been dropped due to criticism over their quality were also criteria that schools had easily manipulated in the past. For example, selectivity was dropped in 2019, and the new 2024 rankings released in September 2023 also dropped class size. In the new 2024 rankings, Columbia rose from 18th to 12th place, tied with Cornell University and the University of Chicago, and ranked above Dartmouth, which fell to 18th. The ranking methodology saw its biggest overhaul in 4 decades in response to heaps of criticism. The new rankings completely dropped class size, alumni donations, and percentage of faculty with terminal degrees from the ranking criteria and gave less weight to financial resources. It placed more emphasis on factors such as graduation rates, first-generation graduation, graduation performance of students receiving government financial aid, earnings of college graduates compared to high school graduates, and rates of research citation in top academic journals. These changes seemed to result in many public universities rising steeply in the rankings and some private schools falling, but little change at the top of the chart. Columbia likely significantly benefited from these new changes. 2 categories it had previously been inflating, class size and faculty with terminal degrees, were removed entirely, while another, financial resources, was given less weight. Despite exposing Columbia's manipulation of the rankings and encouraging greater transparency from the school, Thaddeus has repeatedly noted that his real purpose is not to rehabilitate the rankings, but to show that they are irredeemable. In his Columbia expose, Thaddeus suggested instead that students use government websites like the College Navigator and College Scorecard, which compare specific aspects of specific schools. Despite constant criticisms and scandals concerning the rankings, high school students and their parents continue to use them as a method of evaluating schools and often cite beliefs that schools with the best name recognition can contribute to their success in landing jobs with top companies. While dozens of law schools and medical schools have recently stopped participating in the rankings, few national universities have decided to pull out of the undergraduate rankings. A former president of Tulane cited possible beliefs that pulling out of the rankings might hurt your rank because the U.S. News would rank you anyway, or that refusing to participate might lead to suspicion that you wouldn't have been highly ranked. Many schools surveyed by the New York Times said that rankings simply helped schools attract attention in a sea of over 2,500 four-year programs, a much larger pool than, for example, only about 200 accredited law schools. As long as the rankings retain their importance to students, they will retain their importance to most colleges. And as long as most universities continue to participate, the rankings will continue to have power.